You're listening to That'll Preach. We've got on our show today Dr. Matthew Lee Anderson. He's assistant professor of ethics and theology at Baylor University's Honors College. He's also a co-host on Mere Fidelity, which is a podcast on faith, theology, and ethics. He's written a couple books. He's written Earth and Vessels, Why Our Bodies Matter to Our Faith, as well as The End of Our Exploring. And we're glad to have him on the podcast here with us. Matt, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on. I think I'm looking forward to this, but I'm not entirely sure. I'm a little apprehensive.
Yeah, the jury's still out. Out. But we want to talk today on an interesting paper you've written about whether or when is there a Christian responsibility to gossip. And gossip is talked about a lot in the church. And I thought this was really an interesting topic to take on. And I'm curious, just the backstory of it. What got you inspired to write on something like gossip?
Yeah. Well, I do theological ethics, which means that I'm the guy to call if you want some reasons to do what you were going to do anyways. And so I needed some reasons to justify gossiping in some cases. That's a bit of a joke. Actually, that's 100% of a joke. That's not how I ended up taking on the subject. But it is the case that there were personal, practical situations that I was adjacent to where there were known bad actors. And it's a common phenomenon, right? You're at a place of employment or a church, someone has done something, they've wronged another person, and you have to deliberate. What can we say about this? Who can we say it to? How can we speak about this to them or to third parties? And so I found myself in a couple of situations where people were running through this set of questions. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. I think these questions are more complicated than just a, like standard do not gossip line would take. I think there's actually a lot of ambiguity about what we mean around gossip, about the sorts of context that we would gossip in. And I wanted to try to clarify some of those stakes and some of those situations. So that was really the genesis. It was actually a paper that was rooted in personal experience of reasoning with people about what they could speak about, what they could say, and how they could say it.
It's interesting that gossip becomes a topic of interest. Sometimes the context, you're like, okay, this is a little weird. People are using gossip as don't gossip as a defense to protect something. Usually when there's scandal, people, signing NDAs, all these types of things, gossip becomes a terminology that's thrown around to say, we're trying to stay above board here,
Yeah.
But I think what's interesting about your article is you note how that can actually aid something even more destructive than whatever the perceived threat of gossip could be.
Yeah, so I start with Pope Francis, who has, over the course of the last few years, issued a number of very strong statements against gossip. I mean, he had a line where he compared gossips to terrorists who throw bombs at people's reputations. And on the one hand, I think there's some truth to the metaphor of killing people's reputations. On the other hand, you just want to say, read the room, Pope Francis. Like to denounce gossip in the midst of the ongoing revelation of sex abuse scandals sounds like you're actually trying to protect bad actors within your community. Now, I don't think that that's what Pope Francis was doing. I think that would be a suspicious or cynical reading of what he was trying to do in those cases. I think what he's trying to do is warn people against engaging in forms of speech that are genuinely destructive without being responsible in how they're speaking. But it's still almost the wrong message. But in one way, I actually think for gossip to be done effectively, you do actually have to have really robust prohibitions against it in a community. I think you have to say regularly, gossip is bad. Don't do it. Like, don't speak freely about third parties behind their back. Don't engage in trivial speech. Don't detract others. Don't pull them down behind their backs. Don't do any of that. All of that sort of speech will destroy a Christian community. I think you have to have a really robust culture of prohibitions on those types of speech so that when people do gossip when they actually do communicate, so and so did this and it was very bad and you should be careful, that people take that seriously. Because if you don't have a culture, or if you have a culture where people are talking all the time about third parties and saying, oh, so and so did this, so and so did that, you actually have a tough time separating the signal from the noise, as it were. It's like, oh, I'm hearing so much about these third parties, I don't know how to tell what's true and what's not. Versus if that doesn't happen very often, if someone comes along and says, hey, Joe did this, then I think, oh, I've got to take this really seriously. It's a big deal in our community to talk about this third party behind their back. It's really risky. We think that you might be doing something morally bad by speaking in this way. I actually have to weigh this very, very seriously in a way in which I might not have to if everyone was talking with each other all the time.
So you're not saying that. So basically, your definition of gossip is not one that has, of course, I have to bring up definitions and the one analytic philosopher in the room. But it seems like you agree that there's a distinction here between gossip when it's condemned in the New Testament, and it seems even the stuff that Pope Francis is writing about is talking about people behind their back, perhaps in ways that you wouldn't ever be willing to confront them face to face, or perhaps even speaking without knowledge or speaking without good evidence, or delighting in the communication of secret knowledge, or those sorts of things seem intrinsically bad. So when you say gossip could be permissible sometimes, you mean spreading true information to people who could benefit from it in certain kinds of cases. Could you, I mean, are there examples of where you think this might be particularly salient, or?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of the examples that you gave about, speaking ill of others or speaking about bad things that they did, they can't be intrinsically bad, right? Certain aspects that you named are intrinsically bad, but others I think are just bad,
right?
As such. They're sort of, so Aquinas has this distinction, I think, between kind of natural evil and which would actually be a moral evil. And there are lots of natural evils like death that we would rightly resist, right? In certain contexts, inflicting that natural evil on someone constitutes murder. In other contexts, like just war, for Aquinas, I think, that does not constitute murder. It's an authorized killing. So even though you're inflicting a natural evil on someone, you're doing so in such a way with the right intention and the right circumstances, right, with the right form, that it authorizes that action and makes it morally permissible. I think something similar is true about gossip, such that the forms of speech that we engage in a pernicious way on a regular basis, where we're talking bad about Joe, as we're sort of just comparing notes and we're pulling him down and making ourselves feel better because, he's laughable and we're not. Like, I think that's actually a bad form of speech. And it's morally bad if we're doing it for the sake of building ourselves up or just to tear him down. It's morally appropriate if we're in a situation where Joe is a bad actor and the person that I'm talking to is at risk of, being harmed by Joe in some way. And here's the other qualifier that I'd add. I don't have obligations or responsibilities to fraternally correct Joe. Right. So that for whatever reason, Joe is beyond fraternal correction. I know that like multiple people have gone to Joe and tried to say, hey, you've done this bad thing. Don't do that. Repent. And Joe's been like, it's not bad. I'm fine. Right. And everyone thinks, oh, if we continue to try to press Joe on this, he's just going to get worse. If that's the case, then I don't have any obligation to go to Joe, but I do need to protect Sam. And so I go to Sam and say, guess what? Joe is a really abusive boss. He's going to like verbally torch you. He's going to emotionally manipulate you. He's going to do all these things and you're going to feel terrible at the end of every single workday. And that's a part of his character. And you need to know that so that you're protected. That tears down Joe's reputation, right? Like it defames Joe, but it's the sort of speech that I think we have to be able to participate in. If we're going to create healthy communities where we protect people who are in danger of being harmed by bad actors.
Whenever you keep saying bad actors, I'm just like, I just literally am like, you're around like Vin Diesel or something just all the time. Like, where are you hanging out and meeting all these actors? That's interesting, especially when you talk about like the third party aspect seems important. Because it's not something you're doing to defend yourself necessarily, or to certainly it's not for self-centered means, but you are recognizing that somebody else is going to be harmed if this information is not brought to light. Is it that third party a key aspect of it?
I think the third party aspect of it is crucial. And this is a piece of a broader question about the role of our own reputation in the moral life, right? When should we defend our own reputation? When others defame it? I actually think that I probably should never defend my own reputation for my own sake. Like, I think the sort of cases where, I mean, there's lots of reasons why. One is just a practical reason. It almost never works. People who defend their reputation for their own sake end up looking defensive, and everyone interprets that as a sign of their guilt. So there's that sort of risk if you defend yourself. But I do think actually, there are third parties who are connected to me in some ways who might themselves experience some sort of social harm if if I'm subject to false accusations. In those sorts of cases, I think it's reasonable for me to defend my reputation for their sake, right? So that they don't suffer harm as additional innocent victims of false allegations. And so I think that the presence of third parties in our moral reasoning of reputation is really pivotal. Like, much hangs on the fact that it's not just me and my social identity that's at stake in these things. It is actually other people who are connected to me. And so, defaming someone else for the sake of protecting a third party, I think that reason sanctions all types of speech that would never be sanctioned in other types of contexts.
Well, you talk about how this can be a legitimate form of Christian discourse, which I think is interesting, because I can see somebody saying that, okay, I get it, maybe in a corporate setting that makes sense, maybe in a legal setting, but actually to say that in the Christian sphere there may be times to do this.
But I do want to underscore, there's ways in which I wrote this paper a couple of years ago, and it's a kind of fun thing to do. It feels like academic clickbait, like, oh, you thought gossip was bad, but now I'm going to tell you, actually, there's some context where it's good. And I do wonder about the emphasis that I have in that paper. And I worry about treating this issue as a kind of standalone, because I think there's another side to our Christian communities where we do not have cultures of fraternal correction. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this over the last year and a half. And if you don't have a robust culture of fraternal correction where people go to each other directly and say, I think that you have wronged me or wronged some other party. If we don't have that, then I think that the justification for gossip becomes a kind of rationalization, right? We're trying to let ourselves off the hook from doing the really hard thing of going to each other and saying, you have sinned, dear friend. Or at least it seems to me, can you explain to me how what you've done is not sin, right? And having those sorts of hard conversations. So I do want to say, in a Christian community, it only works. Like, gossip is only justified as a kind of last resort, right? And in that way, it does fit kind of modern just war principles, right? It's an option of last resort. And you really have to have fraternal correction and some of these other things in place for it to be even effective or justified.
It's got to live in a healthy ecosystem, it sounds like, because, and I noticed, and I mean, I think we've all been guilty of the sin of gossip, and there is a feeling of you're letting yourself off the hook, usually from doing the fraternal correction that would require a level of courage. And it's like a pseudo confession, or it's just like it does have this kind of psychological effect of lessening the burden on you at the expense of the other person. And so that's a very key I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that
but it's also really hard because there's lots of contexts where we need to seek counsel.
That's true.
right?
Yeah.
And seeking counsel about a situation or a person will often involve saying enough defamatory things about them that the person is able to give meaningful counsel about
Right.
how I should act.
Right.
Right. And one of the things that has happened with Christian speech and over, generations is the decline of the confessional as a place of counsel and not only confession, but a place where the confession is intertwined with direction and counsel about what a person should do. The decline of that has meant that sort of there aren't authorized venues for speaking about other people in the church in healthy or constructive ways. And, and there's a question about whether the confessional ever really secured the church from engaging in those sorts of malicious types of speech. The medievals are just so concerned about sins of speech. They are intensely focused on speech, and they do have the confessional, and they're providing priests with really robust norms and directives about how to speak with people about wrongdoings and what the boundaries are about whose wrongdoings can be brought into a confessional. So there's a question there about whether that's ever happened, but I do think actually we do need authorized forms of counsel where we can speak freely about what we have perceived to have been like bad actions by others, so that we can gain the courage and the wisdom through that process to then go and fraternally correct in a healthy way. Because if I'm just like, they've hurt me and I feel hurt, but I'm not entirely sure that I have been hurt, the odds of me going and fraternally correcting that person and screwing that up and alienating them, very high, right? I've got to talk through that with someone who can, say like, no, I really think that like in this respect, that really was wrong with them if that's what they did. But this other respect that you're feeling, that's kind of you, right? Like you're overly sensitive in this way. I've got to be able to have that conversation so that when I go to them, I'm like, here's the thing, as I've thought about it, that really troubled me about what you said. And they can receive it, and I can distinguish between that thing and all the other things that they said that were right. Sorry, there's a long, rambly answer, but we do need not just fraternal correction, but real counsel, real opportunities for these sorts of dialogues with people about third parties.
So when you say that, so basically the defense of this qualified gossip here really comes at the end of this chain of, it sits in a much larger project, right?
Yeah.
Where it's about, if you think that speaking the truth towards a good end is good, we can do that. These formal structures like confession, like having groups of people that I can use as sounding boards for my grievances, those can help me weed through how I'm thinking about the offense. And then, so if that tells me that we've got a legitimate case for fraternal correction, yes, you've actually been wrong. Yes, the way that you're construing the offense is right. Like you're justified, you've got claim, you've got standing, all of this stuff is right. Then
Yep.
I can proceed to fraternally correct. And then if that doesn't work, and presumably other people in the community have also intervened, that doesn't work. This person's not changing their behavior. They're not recognizing they're wrong. Now, the gossip here that you're defending is just, well, I can speak the truth towards a good end, namely to let others see that this person is a bad actor and prevent them from ending up in a similar situation to my own, which is also getting wronged by this person. So, I mean, in one case, it does sound kind of like, I mean, I think everyone would agree with this. This seems like it's not that counterintuitive of a conclusion, right?
I hope so.
Yeah, this seems
mean,
very plausible.
It does. But then, as I was working on this paper, I had a friend who I was talking with about it, who said, "Oh, do you know about this church's policy on gossip?" Yeah, it's a church in my current hometown, where I will not name the name of it, though I think I link the podcast of it in the paper. So if you're really intrigued, you can go look that up. But this church has a policy of, it's a zero tolerance gossip policy. And the policy is, if you talk about anyone in the church behind it, and I think this is only for the leadership, for people on staff, but if you talk about anyone else on staff, not like with them not in the room, you have to go to them.
Surely that's not like, I mean, you can't say like, we had a great time at Pastor so-and-so's barbecue last week, like when they're not in the room with you. That
I'm presuming that they are assuming that this is negative speech about a third party, but it's a 24-hour rule. You have to go within 24 hours to that person directly and make repair and restitution for what they said. I think this is an interesting question, because if you both speak ill of me, which is highly likely after I'm done with the podcast, right? And you don't never, like, I might never know. And whether or not you have to make restitution to me is, I think, an open question. Right. If I never know, if you repent, if you like sort it out afterwards and are like, hey, we said all that stuff about Matt, we shouldn't have done that. We don't actually think that's necessarily true. Or here's another way of telling the story. And you frame my existence in such a way that it becomes more palatable and you're able to act towards me in charity once again. I think if you do all that, that might be fine. And you don't have to make restitution for that sort of backbiting or defaming. But I'm not sure on that. Right.
Or if you limit the damage you've done, or if you go back to the person and said, I gossiped, that was wrong of me to say that about this person, or you could, that could be acceptable.
I think if you do that, you that might be enough, because I don't know. It's not like I will ever learn that you have done that about me. And so I don't have any sort of sense that I've been wronged by you.
Okay, good. So Paul, we're in the clear. You. All the things we said, or you were telling me about that.
So
we're in the clear. We're good.
Everything, and there's so much to say about me that's negative. So I'll just grant that to you both and to all of my critics. Right? Like I'm giving everyone ample opportunity and basis to speak ill of me.
Terrible takes about theology, but great takes about Mexican food in Waco.
Your confession.
You want to know the food scene in Waco? I'm your man.
There you go. I think on your most recent Mere Fidelity podcast, you guys were talking about casuistry, and I hope I said that right. And
you did, yeah. Importantly, not casuistry.
Yeah, right, not casuistry, and yeah, I guess it's a debate on whether confession ever really did what you were ideally hoping it would do. But I have noticed in times, just in ministry, people will say, and they're genuinely trying to work through something like, have I actually been sinned against? Am I being too sensitive?
Yeah.
When this person said something, do I need to correct them? Is this, and then they have to say what it is. Otherwise I can't really, but then there is this understanding of like, okay, there's an understanding from them that I'm going to keep things confidential about them, and that I'm not going to try to ruin that person's reputation or spread that around. But then I hope, and maybe I could do better on this, there's an understanding from on my end that they understand from me that I am doing this to help them act in a proper way, not just trying to be a venting sounding board or like just someone offloading their grievances with somebody, but that there has to be some kind of positive step toward reconciliation or anything like that. Because I think you're right. And your caution about like, you don't want this to be a rationalization for like our base desires or anything like that. But you do, that's really hard to cultivate the kind of culture in which those things are understood, and where gossip is so rare that when something does come up, it's sort of been organically vetted as like, we probably should look into this because we're not a gossip culture. This is a genuine red flag.
Yeah, I think that's right. Your point about how the type of speech or the nature of the speech act when someone comes in, asks you for counsel, changes the moral significance of it, right? Like this is not just venting my spleen at this situation. This is a genuine attempt to discern what the good and the right is. But so much of ordinary trivial speech about others has that type of effect, even if indirectly, right? We learn about the moral life through speaking about what others do or do not do so much. And this is where, like, why the acute sensitivity to vain or idle speech that the medievals have is really authorized by scripture, right? Where you have Jesus saying, every word that you utter will be assessed, will be judged at the last days, which is, I think, the most terrifying line in all the Bible. Like, if you want to think about the scope of God's judgment and whether or not, like, I'm off the hook for anything, all of the accidental, incidental, thoughtless comments that I make will all fall under the scope of divine judgment. And that makes me want to have a kind of hyper intentionality about speech, to just be really attentive and aware at all times of what I am doing when I'm speaking and what I'm intending to do when I'm speaking, and to allow those intentions to, as much as I can, be motivated by love, so that my speech is not vain or empty or idle, right? Like the prohibitions. And this is where I actually do wonder whether the category of gossip is helpful, because it seems almost too broad, right? It encompasses defaming speech on the one side, but then it also encompasses the idle chatter that could just be about third parties, that may be defaming, but might not be, right? It's just sort of, you're telling trivial tales about a person's life. And the norms against that scripture lays down, those really haunt me. But the other side of it is, our moral formation as people seems inextricable from these types of speech. Like, we just learn so much, because we cannot experience everything directly about the moral life that we need to know, right? We have to be able to experience things vicariously by watching others and by hearing others. And the only way in which we can do that is through gossip. And so I do feel of two minds about the role of this sort of speech in the Christian life, because on the one hand, we have these prohibitions. On the other hand, I just think, what else are we going to talk about?
Maybe one way to take all these insights and hold them together is, so we know that there are two ways that we can err. We can err on the side of a strict prohibition against gossip, or we can err on the side of a really lax position towards gossip and defamatory speech. And given the stakes, given what you were just talking about, God demanding an account of every word we say, the ease with which we can slip into idle chatter or defamatory speech, or just using speech poorly in ways that undermine fellow image bearers, perhaps the warnings that are, this church that you mentioned, no gossip ever, it might be over calibrated, and it might be making a strict principle out of something that's just supposed to be a guideline. But given the stakes, maybe it's a helpful corrective. It's like when you've got kids, you over calibrate the warnings. You tell them, don't go near, the pool, when actually you're worried about them drowning. You don't want them in the deep end, but you like build a hedge around the dangerous thing. And given just the propensity of human nature to, if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile, and given also the high stakes of, using language is a really serious thing when we use it poorly. Perhaps we should err on the side of an overly restrictive ethic concerning speech, rather than, even though you're technically right. So we can say, philosophically, there are in principle cases where this is permissible. Perhaps we should recognize human nature has a tendency to slide in this direction, and so put a preventative curb there in the form of these really, really strict, overly calibrated warnings. I don't know. What do you think of that?
Yeah, there's different ways of framing this. So you use the guidelines framework. Another way to frame it would be something like, there is actually an absolute prohibition on speech of this kind. It's just
Sure,
underspecified. We just have to specify the context in which this prohibition applies. And the work of specifying the context will show us that there are other types of contexts where we can speak in a way that would seem like it fits the prohibition, but is fine. I think I like that way of framing it a little more than guidelines, because I tend to think that the guidelines language, I worry that it allows me too much flexibility. Like, oh, those are just, and maybe it's just I have the very dumb, very bad early 2000s Pirates of the Caribbean in mind.
They're more
right?
like guidelines.
They're more like guidelines, which is, I think about every time this sort of thing comes up. The rules of parlay, more guidelines, right? And they're just sort of like, oh, I can change those whenever I want, according to. But I think actually the language of absolute prohibition helps me. It raises the moral stakes for what I'm going to do. I also think it's worth really trying to underscore and form people to see what they're doing when they're defaming a third party, right? Is the imagery of terrorism or death and killing the right sort of imagery to use to speak about defamatory speech? If it is, then that type of speech should only be done in very, very special circumstances under church authority, maybe, right? Like you want some sort of, I too am a man under authority. Like I recognize I can't just go kill people's reputations indiscriminately on my own private judgment. That's too heavy a weight to bear. And I think that's the sort of like moral formation. We really have to think about what is the value of these people's reputations in this community, and what happens if we do destroy their reputations, even if it's just to do so. What happens to them, and will that be good for them in addition to good for the people who they might injure or harm, right? And to that extent, like, it is a question of what loving the enemy requires in addition to protecting the vulnerable, right? Like those two have to be held together.
It could be loving the enemy to kill their character in certain cases, assuming you've gone through all the proper channels. If a damaged reputation undermines your ability to keep doing wicked things, that is God's grace to you. So it could be a way of loving someone, assuming you've gone through all the requisite channels, like you mentioned, this is the last resort, but it's not only protecting to the people who are likely to be abused and oppressed or whatever. It's still also it's a grace to the person whose character is being killed by preventing them from being able to do the abuse later on.
I think that is right. So I want to say, yes. I think that's right. At the same time, the medievals, like Aquinas and Augustine, I think has this principle too. I think Cicero has a view like this. They have this notion that when people lose their reputations, their good names, they're liable to act worse than they would have otherwise. Because there's something about having a good name that's actually a check on bad conduct, right? There are principles of shame and stigma that keep people from acting in really pernicious ways. That's I don't know what I think of that principle, but I want to take it seriously. Like, I don't want to discount that necessarily. So that's one caution about it. The other caution that I have on these cases is when I do defame a person, when I do destroy their good name in a community, even if it's just, I create circumstances or conditions that make it almost impossible for them to re-enter the community. And what are the conditions under which they could be restored to the community itself, not to leave? I mean, in so many cases, I think, where people lose their good name in a community, they just up and move, right? They'll move into new communities. And I understand that, but I actually think that just avoids the moral question of what are the conditions under which we would be able to restore someone to their good name. And that's a question that I think we have to take very seriously as Christians in the context of the justness of killing. It's not just is it right or appropriate to destroy this person's reputation, to kill this person on the field of battle. What are the subsequent conditions that need to be in place for a peace to be established that would bring this person back into a harmonious or right relationship with us? And I think that's very hard to do when we have destroyed people's reputations. And that makes me want to even be more cautious about doing so, right? Which is probably why I think, like authorized war, like is a principle that exists within the just war tradition. And I think actually, I don't develop this, but I wonder whether something similar does need to be in place here.
I do think there is something to what you mentioned about Aquinas talking about a good reputation could be a deterrent from them acting bad. I mean, because they don't want to lose their reputation. And when they don't have it, I think about if someone's canceled, one way is just be like, all right, well, now I can just go ballistic. It doesn't matter. I mean, all the consequences are gone. It could actually make them even worse. And so keeping their reputation intact can be a way of actually minimizing the damage they do.
And this is why I think it's important that the norm Jesus does lay down for fraternal correction begins with privacy, right? That you go to a person in private. And the underlying logic there, as Aquinas and I think the medievals develop it and get it right, is something like protecting someone's good name is valuable for them. And insofar as we were able to do that while correcting them, we should try to do that. Now, if that fails, eventually there's this norm of public denunciation where you actually do have to say publicly. But actually, I mean, this is the other challenge to my gossip view, is I do not have. So, Paul, you laid out all the steps, which I think was really helpful, that you would have to go through to get to my position on gossip. One of the steps that you left out that I think we need to slot in somewhere is, at what point do we publicly denounce this person? At what point are we authorized in, and what's the forum? Going on Facebook, right? And saying, everyone needs to know that so-and-so is a person like this and has this sort of character. I think that that's an incredibly hard question, and I don't have good answers to it. And there's so much about media that should shape, I think, our moral reasoning about that type of question, right? Do we put it in writing? Because once things are in writing, they follow that person in a way in which they don't otherwise. But then, these days everything's on YouTube and TikTok, right? Like, if I say anything publicly about anyone, the odds that someone is filming me while doing so are decent. And so, like, how do you publicly denounce someone for bad action in ways that don't turn it into the type of globalized destruction of the person's reputation, not only in that community, but everywhere they could possibly go on this earth forever and ever. Amen. Right? Like, that's very disproportionate to a lot of wrong acts, right? Like, and so the public denunciation piece of this is a real problem.
Yeah, I mean, you're making me never want to ever engage in defamatory speech against anyone, just because it seems like there's so many ways that it can go wrong, and so much that you have to do upstream to make sure you don't do something bad downstream. Yeah. And it might just be that it's so complicated that no individual should ever make this calculus on their own. And even even entrusting it to church leadership might be too much. I don't know. I mean, depends on your view of how you think church structure should work. And if you think like bishops need to get involved, or like what the proper chain of authority should look like. But it's definitely not something that an individual can do on their own, just because you're not going to have the kind of perspective necessary to get all of the relevant information and make sure all the boxes have been checked and make sure that the downstream repercussions are not worse than the initial whatever, or make sure that you're not going to do more damage to their reputation that will actually incentivize further bad behavior. And there's so much that can go wrong out of your hands when you do this thing, that maybe this is just a practical caution against ever engaging in this on your own. And so that seems right. I think if you're trying to like deter people away from doing this by showing how many ways it could go wrong when you try to take it into your own hands, I think that case is really strong. It's kind of terrifying.
But when does it go right? I'm trying to think. The reason that the policy of like the 24-hour no gossip, whatever that whole thing was, is just, I mean, you think about, I do think this is overblown, and I think there's bad actors on both sides about sort of the whistleblower culture and like, here's what's going on behind the scenes at this church. And then turns out it was right. And then they're heroes and they were brave. But then there can also be the dark side of that, where people are genuinely slandering institutions, slandering churches, because they have bad motives and all that stuff. But when does it? A positive case sounds like when you know, okay, the pastor's embezzling funds. Okay, there's a sexual predator, in this congregation, and we've got to, for the sake of protecting kids, ruin his reputation. I mean, those are some of the extremes that are coming to my mind. Would those be times when it's proper to gossip? I'm trying to get just like a concrete, when does this actually work? When is it actually a good idea?
I don't ever want to say that Paul is right once, much less twice.
Come on, Matt, say it. We're recording this for posterity. I'm going to use this in my tenure application.
Yeah, they'll be like, no, dude, that's amazing. You're hired.
That will not help you anywhere. Me saying that you're right is only a net negative in most quarters.
Matt's already lost his reputation.
Yeah. But I do actually think that the principle of like just never, that Paul developed, like just don't do this, is attractive. But I do think it is probably untenable, Brian, because of those types of situations that you mentioned, and the fact that sometimes they are real and people find themselves in them and they have to do something. I do think that if we are thinking about reputation as a type of killing, then you think like there's some sort of proportionate like calculus, right? Some criteria of proportionality that we would apply, such that the act that we are undertaking this for has to be sufficiently grave in its badness, and people's, lives have to be sufficiently imperiled that we would be willing to do it, right? There's some sort of interesting paradox here where the less serious the wrong is, the more open the offender might be to fraternal correction on it. And so the less need there would be for getting to the gossip stage, right? The more serious the wrong that I discover, the more is at stake for the wrongdoer, and the harder it might be for them to receive fraternal correction well and successfully, because if they've been engaging in a secret wrong for a long time and hurting people, but it hasn't come to light, their position is on the line. For a lot of people in these cases, it's their livelihoods that matters the most. It's my job, everything that I have done for 15, 20 years to get to this place, I'm going to lose it all. And they will respond with a sense of desperation because they don't know what they would do otherwise. And they're going to lose their house, everything that they have. And so their openness to fraternal correction is very low as a result. It's very hard for them at that sort of place to say, oh yes, I see that I have been engaging in bad conduct for this long, and now let me repent and be contrite and publicly sort of acknowledge my wrongs in these sorts of ways. Their tendency is going to be to clamp down and carry on and try to protect what they have built. And that's going to be more dangerous to other parties. And so the need for public denunciation on the one side, gossip on the other, goes up in that sort of cases. So it does feel like you called them extreme circumstances, Brian, but those are the sorts of cases that I think actually have to occur for this to work. The other thing I want to say is, like, you got to have knowledge. And I don't do epistemology, so I'm not going to tell anyone what that is. I leave that to other more qualified people. But you cannot just suspect someone of wrongdoing. Like, that's whatever the gap is between suspicion and knowledge. You've got to be able to say, no, I know that this wrongdoing is occurring, if you're getting past the fraternal correction stage and defaming them to a third party, right? If you suspect someone of wrongdoing, then I think you go to them directly and say, I really suspect that you are engaging in this wrongdoing. Tell me I'm wrong. Show me what the evidence is here. But if you're going to reach the sort of farther stages of this, I think you've got to know. And that's its own check on some of the types of situations that we've seen in the church, because I think there's lots of people who have made allegations and operated towards church leaders on the basis of suspicion. And that's its own sort of deep moral problem, I think.
It is, you think about the Old Testament law, how important it is to have 2 or 3 witnesses, and because it's like, all right,
yeah,
I mean, if this works out and you're right, we're killing the guy. And then if you think about that, you're like, whoa, okay, actually, I want to really make sure. And then there's also a consequence of false witness too. Like, I think in those cases where, one, you better be absolutely sure, as far as that can take you, as reasonable as you can. But then I think you have to be ready. If you're wrong, the restitution, the repairing, I mean, it may be impossible, but there's got to be a high bar for that too, of like, we just got it wrong with this person. And we have to do something equally as, repentant, I guess, or equally as whatever, restitution wise to what we were charging him with.
Yeah, I think that's right. On the other side of it, the burden is on church leadership to embrace transparency in such a way that it's very easy to know that's true. Wrongdoing is occurring, right? So I think Paul, when in one of the Corinthians, I forget which one, this is bad of me, but I think it's 2 Corinthians, he's taking money with him, and I forget who he brings along, but he brings along someone with him.
Yeah.
Seemingly unnecessarily. And it's basically like, I want to be so transparent here. He actually says in the passage that he wants to do what's honorable in the sight of men.
Yeah.
Not only in the sight of God. And he brings along this additional person while he's carrying money with him. I think simply for the purpose of having someone to be able to testify, Paul did not steal the money. He's not in it for the coin. Like, he brought all of the money from this church to that church. It all made it 100%. And that's a sort of principle of transparency that invites accountability, right? And makes fraternal correction from the laity very easy, because they will have a high degree of trust because Paul has brought this person along. And if anything does go wrong, they'll be able to see it, right? So I think it's you're right. People have to know, but I want to put the responsibility on both sides. I don't think anyone's exempt here.
So
I'm really fun at parties. I hang out with me. Here are all the ways in which
someone tries to gossip to you and you just do this, and then you end up shutting down all gossip. Like, we're not gossiping to Matt anymore. You just
oh yeah, no one talks to me about anything, which is great.
There you go.
I'm well outside. But it's fascinating because people who gossip a lot have a lot of power.
Hmm.
So this is the other thing that we have to realize about gossip is people who gossip a lot inside of institutions, that knowledge is currency, and they will be at the center of social relationships and have collect power by virtue of their knowledge. And to not gossip, to not participate in these forms of speech is deeply disempowering. It will effectively self-marginalize you from these types of communities. And that's I think a really important effect of this speech, and is the hardest part of it.
Absolutely, and it bonds people together. You mentioned this in your paper about how it creates strong bonds between the gossipers. It's the whole inner ring thing. I think you mentioned that with C.S. Lewis, where it is there's an incentive to partake in gossip because of the bonds it can form and the advancement it can give you within a professional setting or an institution. And it's like it's like it works. That's like the worst thing. You know what I mean? It works and it's reinforced. And it's terrible. And then I guess that's where that moral courage and formation comes in, where you have to be the one to say, I can't do it like that. I'm going to pay that cost to not participate in this kind of wrongdoing.
Yeah, I'm willingly going to be on the margins of this community. I'm going to be on the outer ring, and I recognize I'm on the outer ring and not a part of the inner ring, and I'm just going to be okay with that. Like that's going to be my path forward, and I'll learn a lot less, but about what's happening behind the scenes and what people are doing, but that's okay.
So part of the corrective to this problem is, I think you were just hinting at it, this individual level developing of virtues, courage to say the right things, not developing the vice of curiosity in sort of the bad way, and like wanting to hear all the weird, interesting little bits of information that you don't need to hear just because it's a way to kill time. And so that there's like an individual level solution, just cultivate virtue. And then there's the more communal level. Okay, we need better accountability structures. We perhaps need better transparency norms between leadership and the laity. How do we do you have any practical steps for how churches can begin developing these more communal level solutions, or how can we cultivate the culture of normalizing fraternal correction, or are we just being sort of philosophers here, or do you think that there's any practical wisdom that you can impart to the everyday person on the ground?
No.
Oh, that was easy. All right. Thanks for listening to the show.
All right. Well, thanks for exactly.
That's basically right. I mean, I do ethics. You want me to solve all your problems here,
Paul?
I
feel the same way, but I thought, I thought maybe theologians they're a little bit closer on the ground. Maybe you guys have you're more in touch with your pastoral dimension.
I think I should be. Because I actually do believe in the need for imaginative and creative proposals of this sort, and for the need for people like me to walk alongside churches. But because of just dispositionally the way I work through so many of these issues, if I tend to be reactive in the sense that, like, give me a church, let me go in and think with the church about what's happening and come up with ideas. And I know church has called me to do that on this project, which is fine. Like, I haven't
You're a
put
gossip
myself out
consultant
there
now.
A gossip consultant. Yeah, that's where the big bucks is. This is finally I will make some money. No, but I mean, like, there's all sorts of ways in which leadership, I think the formation of leadership to be amenable to and open to fraternal correction themselves, and to make that a part of their culture, and to invite that even from the laity, I think that would go a long ways towards creating a culture of fraternal correction, right? The being regularly in touch with, I know there's all sorts of like cliches. Oh, I sinned more by the time I sort of got out of bed this morning than my kids, did, right? Like, these sorts of cliches about how much we sin get thrown around all the time, but they usually don't have a lot of specificity. And trying to be really specific with ourselves, inviting God into the courts of our conscience and allowing him to judge us, and being able to say with Paul, no, like, I don't have anything against myself, which is something he says in to the Corinthians, right? Like, I've scrutinized myself actually, and I don't have anything against myself, but I'm not even the one who judges myself. God judges me, right? The regular process of putting ourselves beneath that court of conscience makes us amenable to fraternal correction ourselves, because then when someone comes to us and says, by the way, you did that, it really hurt me, it'd be like the least surprising thing that someone could tell me about myself, right? Like, I think, yeah, I bet I did hurt you, because I'm the sort of person that does hurt others. And I've seen that about myself, and I've seen ways in which I've done that. And so I'm not surprised here. And that type of self-scrutiny and culture of internal fraternal correction, where we meet God in that sort of way, seems really important to cultivating the willingness to be fraternal corrected, which is a prerequisite to fraternally correcting others in a healthy way, right? This is the plank in your eye principle. You have to scrutinize yourself before you go to another and correct them. And so again, that comes back to what sort of moral formation are we asking our pastors to undertake? Are we asking our leaders to undertake? So it's not really an escape from the virtue answer to this, but I do think that a lot of it starts there for churches and leaderships. It's really about pastors embracing forms of spiritual ascesis, formation, that make this a regular part of their lives.
Do you think going back to like some a member of a church going to their pastor, they're going to have to reveal some things, but they're looking to get some clarity on it? Do you think that should be a more widespread thing or a more understood thing? Like, I almost wonder if that were more of a regular thing. Like, you can have a, not to actually in the Roman Catholic sense of a confessional, but you could have a time, an understood time within the culture of your church, that you can go to an elder, a pastor, a trusted person who is not going to gossip and whatever, that they could actually serve as a way to stem you doing that with your friends and people that'd be less responsible. That you almost kind of, I think about like the purge, I mean, like you have one day where everyone can commit all their crimes so that everyone, but maybe that's a terrible example, but I mean, you know what I'm saying?
I don't know what the purge is, so now I'm very
okay.
disturbed.
I've actually just Wikipedia'd the plot. I haven't actually seen the movie.
That's the most Brian thing I've ever seen.
That's absolutely true. I haven't seen Pirates of the Caribbean. There, I said it. So I haven't seen it. No idea what your inside jokes were on that. So, but yeah, I mean, do you think that bringing back some sort of place where people can be that transparent in a, to coin the term, a safe space where they know that what they're saying will not harm it will be used with prudence by a trusted person, but they also can gain the counsel that they need. Is that a practical way to just open that up a little more?
Yeah, I'd love to see that sort of thing happen. I mean, one central challenge there is people don't trust their pastors. So much of the process of processing these situations has been outsourced to therapists and counselors. That actually, people don't go to their pastors for counsel in this sort of way. And I think that is a deep problem. Now, I think actually, in certain respects, that's okay, because we haven't done a very good job of forming pastors to counsel well and effectively in these sorts of ways. Like, I do think actually, hopefully one thing, if someone has listened to all of this, they've come away with is kind of what Paul said. Like, the distinctions that can be brought to bear here are many, and the degree of difficulty is very high. And a pastor who hasn't really thought about all of these issues with this sort of sensitivity might not be very well equipped to counsel in this sort of way and to provide guidance and direction. And that's its own problem. But I do think actually retrieving or recovering some sort of sense of the pastor as counselor, as someone who is trained in moral theology to provide guidance and to be a sounding board would help people to know how to navigate some of these very hard situations where, the sort of the counselor that they go to who's helping them with their marriage or their lives and other respects, or their therapist, actually don't work in this sort of way, right? Like the therapist is going to try to think about like, well, how are you in the midst of all of this? What's like, are you taking care of yourself? Are you cultivating this sort of sense of differentiation, or whatever the language is, right? Like, how are you? That's going to be what they're going to focus on. They're not equipped to help answer the question, what should I do? Right? Should I denounce this person publicly or not? Any therapist who tries to answer that question is stepping well outside the boundaries of how they're trained and what they're authorized to do. And so there's a real gap here. No one is authorized or equipped to handle some of these situations. And that's fine, actually. Like in one respect, like maybe no one should be trained to do this, and we just have to learn it occasionally. But I don't know. I want someone to think about it who's not me.
So it's kind of like we really should be careful about when we can justly use gossip, and we got to think through it all the way and be trained. And if we're not ready to do that, we should probably just have something of a permanent ban on it, until we're kind of mature enough to do it. But we can't just say that it's never proper. And maybe, that's
don't let children play with guns.
There you go.
We just don't do it, right? And the tongue is a spark that can light a fire, right? Like the imagery, death and life are in the hands of the tongue, says Proverbs. Like, we don't let children play with guns. We shouldn't let those who are immature in the faith make their own decisions, or make decisions about how they speak about some of these types of situations, because it takes a lot of wisdom.
That's well said. Matt, thanks.
I'm really fun at parties.
Yeah,
Invite me to your party.
Yeah,
I'll be pleasant. We'll figure out things to talk about. We can talk about trollop or something enjoyable.
As someone who's actually been to parties with Matt, I can attest he's not always like this. He's actually.
I do feel like such a scold when I talk about some of this stuff, and I don't.
No, it's super helpful, and you're part of your own solution of normalizing and creating this culture of fraternal correction, and bringing theological insights to bear on personal application. So I think it's great.
Thank you. That's very kind.
Well, Paul once told me, since Paul is a moral philosopher, he told me that he hates going to Hollywood because there's so many bad actors.
Wow, that was really bad.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
Thank you.
But that's true in all sorts of ways. Paul, this is just, now that we're wrapping up, someone passed me, I was looking for it. I don't have it in front of me, but it's just worth remembering that as James Gustafson, who is a Christian ethicist at the University of Chicago, apparently said once, a moral theologian is a former theologian who lacks the professional credibility of a moral philosopher. So, if people want to rank where I stand on this podcast, a former theologian who lacks the credibility of Paul.
It's a great game. I'll
Here
just,
endeth the lesson.
No
I know.
comment.
Sometimes I just name different disciplines in university. And I just watch for Paul's facial reaction, and I can tell what he thinks about those. It's hilarious, and he can't even hide it. There's no guile in Paul. He is.
It's true.
It's all there. Matt, thank you for joining us on the show. This was a great discussion, and we'll put a link to Mere Fidelity and all that stuff. But this was a great time, and we're appreciative of you spending your time with us today.
Thank you, guys. This was a lot of fun. Appreciate it.